two, two. Yeah. 212. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Let me try again. Good morning, everyone. We're about to start. Good morning. My name is Dave Cox. I work for the Institute of Natural Resources, which is located about an hour's drive up the road in Pietermaritzburg. And we have an all-Africa team this morning where we are going to be speaking about how we improve the implementation of biodiversity offsets. So I'm going to introduce the team right up front in the interest of efficiency. On the far side of the table there, we have Justine Namara. Justine works for the Uganda Wildlife Authority in the capacity of manager, EIA and oil monitoring. Justine has a master's in natural resource management, and she has been involved in EIA for the last 15 years for developments within protected areas in Uganda. Then we have Andrew Caldwell. Andrew is the Biodiversity Technical Director and Coordinator for ERM's EMA region. Andrew has extensive ecological experience all over Africa on a variety of projects, many of which have involved biodiversity offsets. On Andrew's right is Pam Kershaw. Pam is the Deputy Director Biodiversity Planning for the South African Department of Environmental Affairs, and she's responsible for planning and policy imperatives in South Africa, of which biodiversity offsets are right up there at the moment in terms of priority. And then last but absolutely not least is Susie Brownlie on my left. Susie is based in Cape Town. She has an MSc in Environmental Studies, and she's worked in the sector for the last 30 years. But importantly, she's really focused on biodiversity offsets over the last decade and a bit more, all over the world, a lot in South Africa, but internationally as well. And that involvement includes capacity building, policy development, and all that's founded on a lot of practical experience in real case examples. So that's our team. And the way we're structuring the session this morning is that I'll have a short introduction just to contextualize the challenges we face. And then each of the presenters, there'll be 4 presentations, they'll be short, in the region of 10 to 11 minutes. And what we've done is that we've asked each presenter to really try and pull out the key challenges and also some of the key success factors that are affecting the success of biodiversity offsets at the moment. And then we really want to get interaction from the floor. So we will conclude them with a half-an-hour presentation. Susie has analyzed some of those key challenges and success factors. We're going to screen them, and then we're going to ask the participants to please contribute in terms of those success factors or challenges you feel are missing, and from your experience, which are the real priority ones that we really need to focus on to try and improve the level of success that we are having with biodiversity offsets. So I'm just going to kick off with a bit of an introduction just to contextualize the session. I believe we are live streaming, so welcome to everyone else across the world, wherever you might be. I was quite relieved when I got here, we didn't have to put makeup on, so that was quite good. Okay. So our understanding is based on the BBOP definition of offsets, which is that biodiversity offsets are measurable conservation outcomes, so measurable, resulting from actions designed to compensate for significant residual adverse impacts after appropriate application of the other elements in the mitigation hierarchy. And the goal of biodiversity offsets is to either achieve no net loss or preferably a net gain of biodiversity on the ground. So it's something that we achieve on the ground. And that's with respect to all the elements of biodiversity, so species, habitat structure, ecosystem function, and also people's use and cultural values associated with that biodiversity. So that's our reference point that we are working from. So just to highlight there, in the absence of offsets, we are losing biodiversity due to residual impact cumulatively across development applications. So they perform a very important role in addressing that residual impact. But currently, the situation we have is one of unrealized potential. In theory, they have an important role to perform in the impact assessment realm, but at the moment, we're just not quite getting there. And it is an emerging science and new concept within this sector, so it's understandable it's going to take time. But what I want to show you now is that the level of adoption in terms of commitments to biodiversity offsets is really increasing significantly, both at a national level in terms of policy and law. There's a recent review found that 39 countries have laws or policy on no net loss or net gain, and there's a lot of countries in the process of developing it, and South Africa is one of those. Then there's the financial institutions, which have also defined standards and adopted standards that need to be complied with when they're funding projects. And then even in the private sector, a lot of companies have commitments related to no net loss. And then there has also been a lot of development of guidance and methods to try and give effect to those commitments. So these two graphs just show how the rate of adoption and development of policy and commitments is increasing globally. On the left, that's the, so go back. Oh, sorry. So that's countries' adoption of or development of policy and law, and this is companies. And you can see that the rate is increasing quite significantly. So the pressure is on to get biodiversity offsets right, is what we're trying to illustrate here. Okay. And then there's also important to point out there's been a lot of work done, particularly by the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, around best practice and guidance, defining what we mean by biodiversity offsets, and providing case studies and material that assist in working towards good practice. And that's been done with a wide variety of companies and organizations and across the world. So there's been a lot done. But despite all of this, the success is nevertheless unacceptably low at the moment. We really need to improve it significantly. So a recent review in Western Australia by May et al. Found that at most 39% of the offsets studied delivered on effective outcomes. Many of those offsets, the outcomes were unknown due to either inappropriate or inadequate reporting or reporting too soon after implementation. But the last point is important one. 30% of past offsets were found to be ineffective through non or inadequate implementation. This one is not very clear, maybe not that clear to you, but maybe the thing that stands out for me is that the stats around wetland banking, which is one of the sort of oldest offsetting systems in the world, is quite poor. So 30% of all offsets meet the project's objectives, and it was found that 50% of the offsets were fully implemented. So that's quite worrying. And then in South Africa, SANBI analyzed about 80 of the offsets that have been authorized through EIA, and sort of the take-home message there is that the objective of the offset is only clear in about 16 of the cases, and in many instances where conservation outcomes were unknown or inadequate. So that's the context to our session this morning, and we're really going to try and look at some of the what are some of the issues or real challenges that are leading to these figures, and then also more positively, what are some of the success factors that we have to look at taking forward. Okay. So we'll move on now to our presentations, and we'll start with Justine's.
Move forward.
Yeah.
Press
Forward,
here.
back, pointed. Okay. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Dave has already introduced me. I work with Uganda Wildlife Authority as the manager in charge of environmental impact assessment. And I'm here to share with you the guidelines we are developing as Uganda Wildlife Authority to be able to implement, to design, implement, and work on biodiversity offsets, specifically in protected areas. So, as an introduction, I know most of us know where Uganda lies in Africa. It is in East Africa. But Uganda Wildlife Authority, as an agency in charge of wildlife protected areas, it manages a number of protected areas, including national parks, wildlife reserves, community wildlife areas, and sanctuaries. And also, these protected areas are home to important biodiversity, including the endangered mountain gorillas, the lions, the elephants, the giraffe, and so many endemic birds and other important biodiversity. So, of recent, the organization is faced with a number of challenges, including developments which are taking place in these protected areas, and the government has taken a decision to exploit some of these resources in the protected areas, and as an organization, we are trying to see how do we minimize impacts of these developments. And some of these developments include oil and gas. We've finished a phase of exploration. We are going into the development phase. So we are trying to see how do we minimize impacts of oil and gas on biodiversity. We have a number of hydropower developments, the dams in protected areas. Some of them have been completed, others are under construction. We have roads which are going through protected areas, and some of these roads are being upgraded to tarmac or bitumen. We have mining in the protected areas. We have transmission lines, electricity transmission lines. We have a number of water abstraction schemes. So all these developments come with challenges on biodiversity. So these biodiversity offset guidelines, we think that they will help us to be able to save some of the biodiversity and be able to have the coexistence between developments and conservation. So this is one of the roads that goes through one of the protected area, Queen Elizabeth National Park. You can see it really dissects the protected area. So if there are animals crossing from this side to this side, there will be challenges of road kills and other impacts. This is one of the transmission line that goes through also through the protected area. As you can see, there are pylons, very big pylons, which really pose challenges on integrity of the protected area. This is an access road. When they were constructing the pylons, they used this as an access road. So all these developments that are coming in pose a challenge on the biodiversity. And these guidelines will really go a long way to try to solve some of these challenges. And as I've said, we have had a number of mitigation measures which have been proposed or put in place to minimize negative impacts, and these mitigation measures are spelled out in the EIAs. But where it is impossible to minimize impacts, where we have residual impacts, then biodiversity offsets are usually proposed in the EIAs. But this offset is still a voluntary thing because it's not yet a legal requirement. And in 2017, Combo project, Combo is conservation, impact mitigation, and biodiversity offset. It is a project which is being implemented in Uganda as one of the countries. In 2017, they carried out a gap analysis on the legal framework to find out whether offsets is incorporated in the legal framework. What they found out is that it is not yet explicit in the laws, but it's just an implication. It has some implied things in the law, so it's not yet there as a legal requirement for developers to implement. We are lucky that the government is now revising the legal and policy frameworks, and the national law, the environment national law, it's being revised, and as an organization we've had an input and we have incorporated biodiversity offsets in the national environment law. But specifically for Uganda Wildlife Authority, we have reviewed our policy, and also biodiversity offsets have been incorporated in the wildlife policy. So that's why we are developing guidelines as an institution, given that we have some legal backing, to be able to, one, provide procedures for planning and implementing the offsets for projects that could potentially impact on the protected areas. Secondly, to create a mechanism for monitoring biodiversity offsets, and also to look at the compliance issues. And thirdly, to guide developers on areas where biodiversity offset is not applicable. We are saying that not all projects are offsetable. There are some projects which are taking place in very sensitive ecosystems, for example, in Ramsar sites, in World Heritage sites, where we don't allow those projects to take place, and therefore someone will not come flagging the offset that we can offset these projects in these areas. We will not allow those projects in those sensitive ecosystems. We have a number of guiding principles that we are using to develop the guidelines, and principle number one is that offsets must be the last option. So we are going to be following the mitigation hierarchy, which emphasizes avoidance as the first step. Where you cannot avoid, then you try to minimize. Where you cannot minimize impacts, where you have to go in and implement the project, you have to restore the disturbed areas, and finally do the offsets. So that is the first principle. Second principle, we are saying that offsets must deliver a no net loss or net benefit for biodiversity conservation. There have to be something additional to what is currently in place. So that additionality is one of the principles. Principle number three is that offsets must aim to be like for like. So when you destroy an ecosystem, you have to create a similar ecosystem somewhere else, where it is possible. Principle number four, we are saying that biodiversity offsets should take a landscape approach. It should look at more than the impact site. It should look at the influence, the impact, the influence impact of a bigger area. And also lastly, we are saying that participation of all stakeholders must be guaranteed, so we are not having few people, but so many stakeholders in that effect. The critical elements for the project, for the offsets, one is, when is an offset required? I've already said that we are not going to allow all the projects to take place because they are offsets. So we need to know which projects are offsettable and which ones are not offsettable. The geographical scope and context, we are looking at the landscape approach. Biodiversity assessment and evaluation, who does the evaluation? And what are the methods used to do the assessment? Then we have implementation and management plan, including the technical expertise. We need to look at the coordination of different stakeholders. How do we use funds in case funds are given for offsets? And how do we monitor and ensure that the funds which are given as an offset are used for offset but not for other things? Then we are going to look at compliance and enforcement. If someone refuses or fails to implement an offset, what are the penalties? So all these are covered in the guidelines. Then finally, we will be looking at the review of the guidelines. How long will it take to review the guidelines? We will make proposals, either 3, 5, or 10 years, depending on the situation on ground. What are the challenges and limitations of developing these guidelines? First of all, I've said we didn't have legal backing, but we are reviewing the environment law, the policies, and other legal framework to be able to incorporate the offsets. Because if it is in the law, then it will be easy to implement. The national expertise, this is a new concept in the country. We are trying to build the expertise to be able to implement the offsets. So this is still a challenge, but we think that we will be able to overcome it. The land tenure and ownership constraints, of course, if you are talking about the like for like, if you destroy an ecosystem here, you have to buy maybe land somewhere else, but of course the land issues are a very complicated issue. But the above notwithstanding, the guidelines, we think that they will go a long way in ensuring that biodiversity is protected in the country. And finally, what are our next steps? We are going to do more editing of these guidelines. We'll open it up to stakeholders, including the developers, so that they can be able to understand these guidelines and be able to implement or comply to what is included in the guidelines. The guidelines will be approved by our Board of Trustees, and afterwards, then we'll publicize and also start the implementation of the guidelines. So this is what we have so far, and we welcome the input from all of you to be able to come up with good guidelines to help us in implementing biodiversity offsets in the protected areas. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Justine. So over to Pam. Thanks a lot, Pam.
All right, thank you, everyone. Morning, everybody. Very honoured to be here and excited to see a full room. So, as Dave pointed out earlier, I am the Deputy Director in the Department of Environmental Affairs, responsible for all sort of biodiversity planning related matters, and I am part of a bigger team that is responsible for developing the draft National Biodiversity Offset policy. So I had a bit of a challenge to try and sort of fit the brief for today's session. I would love to have given you probably a half-an-hour presentation presentation, if not longer, on what the policy is saying and such, South Africans' sort of context around offsetting. But nevertheless, I will stick to my hopefully 10-minute brief time slot. So without further ado, I would just like to go into, in terms of South Africa, where we are at currently in terms of how we've been dealing with offsets. So we have offset guidance, but no national policy, and this essentially has been through various provincial guidelines that have been developed in the Western Cape Province, developed in 2007, their guidelines on biodiversity offsets. This was then followed by the KwaZulu-Natal's Conservation Agency, KZN Izimvelo Wildlife's guidelines on biodiversity offsets for the province. Following this, in 2014, the Department of Water Affairs developed their own draft wetland offset best practice guideline. And last year, March, the Department of Environmental Affairs then published the first national draft biodiversity offsets policy for public comments. So the mitigation hierarchy, and this has been mentioned, and essentially is the principal framework for informing effective environmental management for sustainable development. The framework has been in use for many years, since the introduction of EIAs in the 1990s. And it provides various mitigation options to be taken into account sequentially in a hierarchy of increasing risk of failure. So in terms of the policy, we have updated the mitigation hierarchy illustration to show the offsetting is not, we consider, the last resort, but the last step in a sequence of steps to be undertaken in the hierarchy. So given the fact that offsets has the highest level of risk of failure, with that we still consider that the offsetting has also a very great level of, there's a potential for having very desirable outcomes if it is done properly. So from our point of view, in terms of offsetting, we've had just over 10 years experience with dealing with the design and implementation of offsets. And as Dave in his introduction mentioned, we have just over or just under 100 environmental authorizations where offsets have been documented. And of those, I mean, South Africa, we issue about thousands of environmental authorizations, and we only have about 80 odd that require offsets. And of those, I must just add, are not in the true sense of the word offsetting requirements. There are compensation, they're actually more compensation as opposed to offsetting in some instances. So through our experience over the years, we've identified the main challenges, and they are up there. The main challenge, obviously, is the absence of policy. It's created this uncertainty and varying views on what is offsets and what is not, when to consider and when not. Insufficient capacity to evaluate the design and implementation of offsets. Increased or inconsistent decision making often goes hand in hand with the capacity constraints, difficulties in establishing the sustainable financing mechanisms to implement the offset requirements. And then we also have inadequate enforcement and monitoring, coupled with often poorly drafted authorization conditions, making compliance and enforcement difficult to actually to achieve. So in the absence of policy at the moment, there's been strong reliance on making use of existing environmental laws to serve as the basis for offset requirements. In South Africa, it's our National Environmental Management Act, and under that, the EIA regulations, which essentially, in terms of NEMA principles, is translated into the mitigation hierarchy, with offsetting being the last step in the sequence. And then obviously also implementers, developers, EAPs have been relying on the existing guidelines, provincial guidelines. So in terms of the draft biodiversity offsets policy, the policy seeks to now address these challenges. by looking at or trying to address the inefficient and ineffective or incomplete use of the impact mitigation hierarchy, and specifically through by looking at or addressing the misuse or lack of use of the key offsetting component of the mitigation hierarchy due to ongoing policy ambivalence, suspicion around offsetting intentions, and or often fear of offset failure. And this is by slowing the loss and progressively reversing the degradation of our biodiversity and ecological infrastructure by counterbalancing the negative impacts of an activity on biodiversity and ecological infrastructure that remain after applying the first three steps in the mitigation hierarchy: avoid, minimize, and rehabilitate, through the increased protection and better management of biodiversity and elsewhere. So that is essentially our definition around biodiversity offsetting. What we would like to achieve, the objective of the policy is to achieve improved, increased protection and better management. Just some definitions I'd like to flag or sort of pull out amongst a number of others that are contained in the draft policy. As South Africa, we've taken a decision not to follow necessarily the BBOP definitions around offsetting. For the first time in the country, we have a definition around fatal flaw. It has come up time and again during the decision-making process, what is considered as a fatal flaw. And simply put, we see this, we define it as a major defect or deficiency in a project proposal that should result in environmental authorization being refused. Net gain, also we've deviated from internationally recognized definitions around net gain, and it's purely to make it easy to understand. The policy is for people of South Africa, so it needs to be in layman's terms. So just in a simple definition, we regard net gain as increased protection and better management of biodiversity and ecological infrastructure for the benefit of current and future generations. Also, we've made the distinction or provided clarity on the terms that are often interchangeably used: biodiversity offsetting and compensation. They are very different, and we have clearly defined compensation to be not offsetting. Compensation, from our perspective, is seen as usually a contribution to a social desirable cause or intervention as a result of loss, damage, harm, or degradation. So it is different, and it doesn't necessarily contribute to improved biodiversity and ecological infrastructure protection and better management. The policy also, in terms of providing further clarity, provides a set of basic offset ratios to be applied when designing the offset intervention. This is the only instance in the policy where it delves into a little bit on how to do it. Policy is more about what needs to be done. So it gives a little bit of guidance in setting basic offset ratios, and this is essentially speaking to our biodiversity priority areas, and those are in the left-hand column, identified as the first priority areas are irreplaceable critical biodiversity areas with an offset ratio requirement of 30:1, followed by our important or optimal critical biodiversity areas with a ratio of 10:1. Our ecological support areas would require a ratio of 5:1, followed by a 2:1 offsets ratio for other natural areas. So to address the how-to, the policy recognizes the need and encourages authorities, competent authorities, to further compile and publish best practice guidelines, as we already have, to revise them, implementation manuals. This is just a number of examples. It's not exhaustive. Maps and information on desired offsetting receiving areas, recognizing that in many instances it's a case-by-case scenario around the need for offsetting. Competent authorities are encouraged to develop their localized offset ratios, and these obviously then need to be in alignment with what the draft policy, the policy when it's finalized is saying. So in terms of next step in the process, we're now at the sort of far down the line in finalizing the draft National Biodiversity Offsets Policy. And this is really meant to address the problem around the suspicion and distrust and general discomfort with offsetting. And we see that it would be greatly reduced through clear and unambiguous government policy. The policy is in plain, easy to understand language, and we see this as the first step, a small step in the process, and we intend on having it, submitting it through to Cabinet for Cabinet approval, and this essentially means that it will become national policy, so all competent authorities will be required to implement the policy. You know, through our consultation process, we've realized or recognized that it's crucial to then develop offset guidelines, you know, look into how to address these further challenges. And this would improve transparency and guide capacity building. We are intending on undertaking stakeholder consultations in this current financial year to get the process started and have a draft offset guideline developed. Obviously, through this process, we'll identify the need for the sort of guidelines required. So it's not to say that there'll be one set of national guidelines produced. This is also not reliant on the finalization of the policy, so we see this as a bit of a parallel process. And the third step, awareness raising, similarly also will be something that we will initiate in this current year. We have identified that it would be most probably efficient to address awareness raising through developing or establishing a dedicated offset support unit that would foster and facilitate the implementation of the policy through structured evidence-based organizational capacity building interventions. And this will be sort of a learn by doing, assisting competent authorities at a national level on the best way in terms of the principles set out in the policy on when to offset and when not to offset. And this will sort of in turn build capacity as we go along amongst competent authorities and also the sector. And I suppose hopefully address the fears and distrust and uncertainty around the sort of, I suppose, the swear word at the moment that biodiversity offsets is. So just in a nutshell quickly, we see biodiversity offsetting as an opportunity as opposed to something that we would rather want to keep our hands off. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pam. So those first two presentations were how Uganda and South Africa are dealing with things at a policy level and addressing through policy and regulation and guidance some of those key challenges. So the next two presentations, Andrew, and then mine will look at a case study situation.
Just explain the buttons here.
Sorry, here you go. That's forward, back, and that's pointer.
That's the light. Okay. Thanks, Dave. I'm Andrew Caldwell. I work for ERM, focusing on the biodiversity. I want to talk about my presentation going a slightly different angle from Justine and Pamela. Talk about a specific case study a project that we've dealt with up in Ghana, dealing with trying to find achieve no net loss for migratory birds. Highly mobile little birds. We've got no control over where they're going to move. So uncertainty was the big name of the game here. I'll give you a very brief background to the project, of the kind of impacts, how we dealt with it, with a focus on the challenges the key lessons that we've learned at the end. The stuff is down to the bare bones so that we can focus on the stuff at the end. This project up in Ghana, up in West Africa, the Gulf of Guinea, the site inside an important bird area, the Amansuri wetland, recognized for a number of features, but importantly for what we're talking about, for the birds, the little sanderlings and royal terns. The sheer numbers, these are not endangered species in any way, but the sheer numbers of them that congregate there makes it a very important site for them. And they've triggered the critical habitat criteria according to IFC very comfortably. That's a review of what the site looks like. There's extensive beaches that run for miles. Very nice place to go and work. I'm focusing on sanderlings, these little tiny birds. They're migratory, they breed up in the Arctic regions of Siberia, and they come down for their winter holidays where they can escape the cold. And there's been a little, I think it was Disney or a cartoon movie clip about them. They feed in the surf zone. As a wave ebbs out there, little flocks of them run down and they feed in that, on that wet sand, and the wave comes back, they quickly run out of the wave. They're really entertaining to watch. Little birds, as you can see in this picture, they're being well studied. A number of them have were being ringed. There were a lot of studies happening up in northern Europe on these birds. It was quite interesting to see. The project we worked on, a very brief overview, this is down to the bare bones. Working on a port, planning to build a port on the coast, and that would result in 3 kilometers of beach habitat being lost. And then importantly, the coastal processes, the waves in this area come in at an oblique angle. And just simple engineering that causes a migration of sand down the beach, the waves coming in at an angle, and an obstruction is going to interrupt that movement of sand. And that is going to cause an area, if I can call it downstream, if you can have downstream on a beach, I'm not sure, but you get erosion. We're going to lose an area of beach over there. The engineers have a lot of difficulty pinpointing what the extent of this is going to be. It's very difficult to predict how deep it's going to go, how long that erosion. There's various mitigations that could be implemented to try to reduce it, but I'm not focusing on those now. Some of the challenges that we faced, we were under pressure to achieve no net loss. We've got to come up with quantifiable ways of how we're going to address the loss of habitat to these little birds. Very difficult to quantify because the migratory nature of these birds, this is not the breeding area, different numbers of them arrive through the season, different numbers arrive each year, sometimes they migrate in different directions. And a migratory bird is impacted by things far beyond the project. They impacted in their breeding area, they impacted on their migration route southwards. So numbers of birds appearing on the beach is not a measure of how successful our project, our mitigations are. This is one of the very big challenges. We also didn't know how to predict how big the impact was going to be, as I've just explained. Another challenge is the beach. The legislation in Ghana is much like here. Nobody owns the beach. Everybody's got access to the beach. So we cannot go and define an area and say we're going to protect this patch of beach. That just doesn't work in the legislation. A highly mobile bird, we've got no control over where they're going to move. We cannot go and say we're going to protect this patch of beach and the birds are going to decide, no, they'll go to that other beach over there. Today, that's much better. So we just got no control on these things. And I think one of the big challenges we faced was there was nothing in the literature on how to deal with this. We spoke to people in BirdLife in the UK, and they just said, look, we call this a challenge. We've got no answers for you on how to achieve this no net loss to a level that's convincing to a very big lender. You've got to see it in that perspective. our close analysis of the situation, there was these beaches in Ghana, they extend for many, many kilometers. They don't really change, but there was a key roosting site. There was an estuary, and that's where the birds like to roost. Where at high tide, they will go and roost there, and they feed primarily in the low tide. And so it was distance from that roosting site is what was important to them. They don't want to fly a long distance if they didn't have to. The threats the local threats that they faced, fishing, a lot of fishing on those beaches. The communities fish from the shore with these very big seine nets, a little boat that takes it out, and they pull that. Big groups, all the men from the village come out that day, and it's a big community effort. And then a lot of plastic pollution. We were horrified at the plastic pollution there on those beaches. It's far worse than we see here in South Africa, just because of the nature of the tides and the ocean movements. And a lot of settlement along just immediately inshore related to the fishing, and kids with catapults and just general persecution. We found that this was affecting the birds in quite a big way. We were fortunate in that the Ghana Wildlife Conservation Society, they had implemented a program elsewhere in Ghana along the beaches. They called it Save Our Seabirds program, and they had used this program. They had convinced the fishermen of the value of the birds. The little terns, where the terns were fishing, it was telling the fishermen that's where the fish are. And they'd developed a program where they could convince the fishermen, look after the birds because it's in your own interest. And they were able to show, through the duration of this program, quite a significant increase in the number of shorebirds in these areas that they had worked on. So we copied. We were very fortunate we had a system to copy. The approach we did, I think this is fairly logical in relation, knowing the threats, primarily to protect that estuary, give the birds a safe place to roost, and they will stay. We categorized the beach habitat. We distanced from the estuary, so sort of in terms of prime estate from a sanderling's perspective, the closer to the estuary was better, further was not so good, and then we categorized it based on community level of disturbance, high, medium, low. We overlaid those two layers, and we had quite a mosaic of habitat value for sanderlings. And that that indicated where to target our efforts to protect. And our efforts were to build a community conservation program where the communities are empowered to take charge of their own affairs, to protect their own resources, and specifically engaging the fishermen. And I think what was important, we found that it worked best to have a balance. We could have put all our eggs into one basket, worked on a couple of villages close to the project site, or we could have distributed that effort over a long stretch of beach. The same level of effort diluted over a large area versus a focused effect. It was difficult to know which was going to give the best result, but we found that added a lot of flexibility, that the project could budget a set figure, and based on monitoring of how well it's working, do we spread the effort, do we focus the effort? So we had a very challenging, a very variable situation, so we incorporated that flexibility into the design of the project. So just to wrap up quickly, some of the key challenges. Our target was to protect the little sanderlings, but the mitigation, we had no mitigation that we could implement that directly affected those sanderlings, probably safe for protecting the estuary. But we had to go for a community conservation program to target little birds, to save little birds. That lack of literature that we had, lack of examples to follow. We had a very big lender loaning a massive amount of money for a port construction that costs a lot to build a port, and they want to be convinced that this is going to work. You know, that, so actually to sum up those two, it's that challenge of limiting the risk, of limiting of dealing with that unpredictability and that high risk of failure, that we've got no guarantee that that social program is going to actually benefit the birds, depending it depends very much on the people involved. Some of our success factors, we were building on an existing initiative. We weren't reinventing the wheel here. So we had something to work with. We were dealing with local players. We were dealing with the local threats. To try to focus our efforts on that migratory, when those birds are outside of the project's area of influence, it simply would not have worked. A very multidisciplinary approach. We are dealing with a biodiversity issue, and we were coming with a social solution to a biodiversity issue. I think was a key success factor here, and that flexibility in the design, in the way things were implemented. So, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of story about the Spring Grove Dam biodiversity offset. As I see, I've titled The Long and Winding Road, which shows that we've had a few challenges along the way. Spring Grove Dam it's located approximately 200 kilometers from where we sit today, and it's part of a transfer scheme where the water is transferred from the Mooi River catchment into the Umgeni. Now, the Umgeni enters the sea here in Durban, so some of the water you're drinking today and over the course of the week comes from Spring Grove Dam. So it's a regional dam. The record of decision was issued in 2009, so just take note of that. So that's some time ago. And there were two conditions pertaining to offsets. The first one focused on wetlands specifically, and it required the rehabilitation of wetlands. It gave some indication of where that should be in two catchments. And it focused on mitigating both wetland function and habitat, so biodiversity, and required that separate plans were developed for the individual wetlands. The second condition of the authorization required, again, detailed plans to be prepared, and that looked more broadly at offsets, in biodiversity, so terrestrial biodiversity and habitats. And it also stipulated that the management requirements should be in line with the operational lifespan of the dam. So it gave some guidance around certain aspects of the offset, but it didn't say when it should be put in place and anything about implementation. It just stopped short at a detailed plan. And these are one of the challenges that Pam alluded to in terms of conditions of authorization not being particularly enough around what is required, who's responsible, and by when. So within the dam basin, and this is an agricultural landscape. It's big business, big dairy farms, commercial beef, and crop farming. So it was quite a transformed landscape within the dam basin. And the three systems that we lost wetlands, we lost grassland, and we lost river. And the wetlands accounted for quite an extensive component of the dam basin. So almost 45% of the dam basin were comprised wetlands. But they're relatively transformed, so that they'd been drained and crops had been planted, so they weren't in fantastic condition. The grassland, there were two vulnerable grassland types, and they were also quite fragmented within this agricultural landscape, and there was approximately 215 hectares of grassland that was lost. And then there was 15 kilometers of the Mooi River that was inundated as well, so we lost 15 kilometers of free-flowing river. So despite the sort of fragmented and slightly degraded nature of these systems, they still supported quite a few vulnerable and endangered wildlife species. So those are two indicator species of that habitat, and they were utilizing the dam basin. Okay. So we applied the draft provincial policy which indicated or dictated that the ratio we applied to the grasslands was 3:1, and likewise for wetlands. So the targets you can see on the right, we were looking for 1,400 hectares of wetland, 600 odd hectares of grassland, and as Pam indicated earlier, there was no guidance provided on rivers, so we just went for a straight 1:1. And it's one of the challenges that there's certain systems there's focus on and they have guidance, but in the case of rivers in South Africa, that's lacking. So before I move on, I think the really key thing to understand about this project is because it was built by the Department of Water Affairs, they were unable to purchase a land, so they couldn't actually purchase an offset site. So the offset had to be secured on private land. Okay, and this is quite a key issue in this country, and I would assume other countries as well. Because, for example, here we are battling, one, it increases the cost of the offset, because you actually have to purchase the land and then also maintain it going into the future. And so that has an impact on the finance viability of projects. The other issue is that in many countries, and even South Africa, we're battling to maintain our protected areas. We don't have the budget to maintain what we've got. So there's a challenge to if you transfer a whole lot of new protected areas to the state, it provides a burden on them. And then the other issue is that a lot of this land is, 80% of our biodiversity is on unproductive landscapes. And in terms of food security, we can't be sterilizing areas just for biodiversity's sake. So going forward, we really have to consider how we achieve offsets on private land. And the mechanism we employ in this country is through stewardship, where you can declare a nature reserve on a landscape, but the landowner maintains the tenure, they still own their property, and are able to continue with their productive activities with conditions on what can and can't happen on the high biodiversity areas. So it's an important part of this story, and for South Africa going forward. So we undertook preliminary investigations. We had a whole lot of criteria that we looked at, and we used a whole lot of biodiversity information to identify a suite of different areas that would meet our targets. And we looked across the three catchment areas, and then we went through a prioritization process and looked at which of those sites would give us the best landscape mix of our targets, so across wetlands, grasslands, and river. And then we came up with optimal sites. And the other challenge was that because because now you're offsetting on private land, is the institutional government's arrangements around who takes responsibility for maintaining that site going forward, the financial flows, how does that all take place in the long term. So we came up with some draft ideas around how that took place. Okay. So I think one of the biggest challenges and why it's taken so long to get to the point we're at, which is the sort of final detailed plan, is that we were having to engage with landowners around what are the benefits and what would incentivize them to make the area on their properties available for the offset. So just a summary, at the end of phase 2, our preliminary engagement, we had 15 landowners and we had far more than we needed to meet all our targets. Then when we went into detailed planning, by the end of November 2016, we had 10 landowners who had signed consent for us to proceed with stewardship arrangements and go into the planning process on their property. And we're still achieving all our targets. We had started to fall down on wetlands. And then between December 2016 and February 2017, we had comprehensive engagement with these landowners. And the HCMA was an association of landowners who had a conservation ethic, and we worked very intensively with them and the individual landowners. In the end, the collective fell apart, and we had to deal with the individuals, and we went down from 10 to 7, and now we've eventually ended up with 2 landowners who have signed up. And as I say, this has been over an extensive period of time. It's been very resource intensive. And so we're sitting now with 2 sites. Luckily, the one site is an absolutely magnificent site. And on that, we achieve 200% of the grassland. We achieve the river target, but we are way down on the wetland target. Okay. Just interestingly, some of the challenges that we encountered around the consultation was that there was a change in land ownership while you were engaging with people. Property or legal disputes on the property, so someone might have been interested in engaging with the offset, but there's some legal issue that prevented them from making their land available. The nature of the land ownership, so some of these lands are owned by trusts, so you have to get commitment from all the trustees. That was a challenge. Some landowners were just too old. They couldn't see past next year, never mind 30 years down the line, so the time frame was just too much for them. And quite a few landowners were ambitious farmers who saw the offset on their property as a currency that they'd want to use in future for their own development on their own property. So there was a challenge. But I think the biggest challenge was the benefits. What really constitutes an effective benefit for the landowner? We were offering, so it involved assistance with fire management, clearing of alien invasive species, etc. And being big business, some of the landowners were not interested. Where a site is declared a nature reserve, there is a tax incentive and a rates incentive. But in many respects, where we were just asking for wetlands on a property, they didn't have that financial benefit, and they didn't see the value or benefits in just having the aliens cleared, because there's no, at the moment, no one's hitting with a big stick around that. So they just didn't see the value in it. And this is a challenge that we had. So yeah, a variety of issues. And again, understanding just around stewardship and what the offset was another one. Yeah, and then, so those are some of the challenges we faced in moving to the final situation, where we've ended up with 2 offset sites. And the core site, which is a property, the Springgrove Dam was just over 1,000 hectares. This property is about in the region of 1,500 hectares. The landowner will retain title of the property. With the restrictions will be endorsed on the title deed. So it will be declared a nature reserve in terms of the Protected Area Act. But he will continue to farm it. He's got a livestock and cattle farming. Then there will be a contract between the landowner and the developer for 30 years that defines what they will do in terms of the contribution. So what they'll contribute in terms of restoration and management of the land over that period. And then also define the governance arrangements, so how the developer will pay an implementing agent who will then implement the restoration, and also how there'll be an annual audit and how that will be reported to the competent authority so that they are sure that the offset has been achieved and is being achieved over the longer period. So, as I say, we've got a detailed plan, and it hasn't been quite signed off yet. Everything's in place. There's some final negotiations to be done. But we've achieved our grassland target. We've fallen way short on the wetland, and we've achieved the river target. But for me, what we have achieved is a significant landscape outcome. This property is a really large piece of land. It's bigger, it's almost double the size of Springgrove. The habitat is in pristine condition, far better than anything else in the area. And you see the river runs right through the middle there, and you've got this pristine grass on either side of it, and these fantastic wetland systems running in there. And the value of it is demonstrated by the species that are there. There are only 50 wattle crane nesting pairs in the country, and 2 of them on this property. And you've got a variety of other key species. So one of the things for me was this challenge between specific targets for ecosystems and looking at the landscape approach and what you actually achieve as a conservation outcome. So we're at this point is, do we carry on in trying to find additional wetlands and address that, or do we secure what we've got, which is a really important conservation outcome? So really interesting story and challenge. It's not over yet, but hopefully we'll achieve what we need to. So in just terms of summarizing some of the key challenges, I think throughout the process, the lack of understanding across all the role players, from the regulators to the developer, there was also a wetland, a waterfall that was going to be inundated, and there was a unique assemblage of plants, and the engineer said, we'll just build another waterfall. Then search and rescue was put forward as potentially achieving the offset. So throughout, capacity building with all the role players in the process was important. The lack of policy and guidance, as I said, there was no guidance on rivers. We were dealing with draft policy, no national policy. The governance arrangements, very tricky, and they vary in different contexts for different projects. Who does what and who assumes responsibility. And there was a lot of friction around that. And then importantly, the timing for the consideration of the offset. So we only started dealing with the offset post the authorization. So there was, and what that meant is that they hadn't built in the budget, the cost of the offset into the capex. So there wasn't the money to go forward and do this, and rightly so. They were concerned about committing to an offset when there wasn't the budget. So it was like, now we have this condition, how do we meet it? We don't have the budget. So there was a big challenge around that. And then securing the sites, appropriate sites. It's very resource intensive. So finding and securing the sites, particularly on private land, is a real challenge. I think how we've managed to even get to this point is that some of the success factors is that we set up an offsets working group with NGOs, local farmers associations, to engage intensively with them. I had a very good offset planning team. Susie was our guiding specialist, and then we had good people who developed stewardship and understood it very well and very good with engagement. And then we also had regular engagements with the regulators and the authorities. And then we had very good biodiversity information and plans. So those are some of the things that contributed to us eventually getting to a point where we have something on the table, and hopefully that will be implemented. So that's the Springgrove story. It's been a long and winding road, and hopefully we're getting to the end soon, and it will have some level of success. Thank you very much.
Show me how to drive this thing.
Yeah, I know. I'm back in. It's probably all loaded with this one, discussion. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'm over 10 minutes.
How are you going to do that?
I don't know if we're going to be able to. I think we're just going to
Will
capture
you
now.
take notes?
Yes, I will.
And
Yeah.
maybe we can bring stuff 5 minutes before and you can update
Okay,
on it.
yeah.
Can I just ask?
Yeah, yeah.
Right, good morning, everybody. We've heard from a wonderful cross-section of people developing an offset system and also looking at specific case studies. So we've got the big picture, we've also had insights into the little picture. And with that window, I think it's become quite patently obvious that there are some extremely wicked problems which stare us in the face with offsets. What I'd like to do, Dave, how do I advance? The green button? This one? Okay. What I'd really like to do is, from the presentations that we've seen, I will stay here, from the presentations that we've seen, the success of offset implementation, which is really at the tail end of the whole thing, relies not only on the offset design and the metrics and the currency and all the fine-tuning theory, but it actually goes right back to the start, to how good the EIA is, ESIA. Is the mitigation hierarchy being properly applied through that process? What is the outcome of that? And then if we get into the realm of offsets, if it's recognized as being needed, at what point is a decision taken on, yes, the project can go ahead, or no, the project can't go ahead? It shouldn't, in my mind, be at the start of the offset design process. And we've had an example this morning of one where that decision was, before we've even looked at the offset feasibility, that decision is taken for the project to go ahead. So the offset design itself comes with a whole lot of challenges. And it should meet, for example, the BBOP offset design criteria and BBOP or offset principles. From the offset design process, we go into the actual practical on the ground, let's make this work step of offset implementation. That too comes with its own set of challenges. And in the background, we have a whole host of what I've called here enabling factors, such as really good biodiversity data, good spatial biodiversity plans, priorities that are known for conservation, political buy-in, good policy, good guidance. All of these things are enabling factors. They're not things that we're going to achieve instantly, but they are very helpful to improve offset implementation. So if we can bear that in mind, what I've tried to do here is sum up all the key challenges and critical success factors that were plucked from the previous presentations. So they're all on there, and I can sort of read them. But very, very quickly, I don't want to waste a lot of time on this, but it's no legal basis, no policy or little guidance. Uncertainty has come through repeatedly and in different stages of offset design and implementation. The question around no guarantees, no assurance of outcomes, how do we pin that down? And then Andrew raised the issue of what do we do about offsets for highly mobile or migratory species? The issues of land tenure repeatedly come up. Again, Andrew mentioned how do we design and implement successfully offset actions that rely on social activities rather than on setting aside protected areas. So some of the critical success factors are far better EIA practice. I think many practitioners, many EIA practitioners aren't familiar with the mitigation hierarchy, which people in the offset world take as a given, that we all know what the mitigation hierarchy is. Some people don't know what it is. Good biodiversity data and plans, clear decision-making with very explicit required outcomes. Capacity across the board needs to be built, building on existing initiatives and involving local stakeholders, stakeholder engagement, and then far better accountability, compliance monitoring and enforcement, not just for 2 years after the offset begins, but in the longer term. So these are all the things that we've gleaned from the presentations. And what we've done is looked at the fact that the key challenges actually translate into critical success factors much of the time. So we've tried to combine all the points from these presentations into a summary checklist. This checklist applies more to the system to specific projects, although hopefully these things would help to reinforce better practice at project level. Having said that, what the plan is for this discussion session, and we've got some time, is to invite you to pick your brains on examples, case studies, what you see as the critical success factors and challenges that need to inform better offset implementation. And the idea is that Dave, as the chair, is going to add to this list as you speak. Try and keep tabs on the kind of cases that shine a light on how we can improve practice. And he will give you, we're going to stop just before the end of the session, and Dave will update us on what these priorities are likely to be going forward. So without further ado, Dave, I will move back to that slide. We're opening the floor now, so anybody who has their own experience to tell, their story to tell, their key challenges and critical success factors to offer about how to improve offset implementation, we'd love to hear from you. Please give your name and your affiliation so we know who you are. And if you can keep it quite short, please. These sessions are unbearably constrained in terms of time. Okay, we have hands up. First hand at the back, then we'll come to you, Hugo, and to you afterwards.
Hello, sorry.
I'm just going to move back to the... I'm not moving back at all now. I'm just going to keep that up just for information.
Hi, Susie, and thanks everyone for a great talk. I wrote down my question because I've got a tendency to ramble. My name is Sam Lawrence from Enviro Insight, and I just was looking at the enabling factors, and I just wanted to talk about a disabling factor. And this is a South Africa specific example. And has there been a consideration regarding the reclamation without compensation legislation that is now being tabled in Parliament? I've been informed firsthand that there may be a movement towards absorbing or converting farming lands into formal or semi-formal conservancies or conservation areas to, in sort of for all intents and purposes, bulletproof people's lands against possible reclamation in the future. But with all this effort that's being put in, if the wind blows the other way, and there might be absorption of lands or reclamation without policy, has this been taken into account in your forward thinking in the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years?
Sam, thanks. It's a very South African specific issue. It almost deserves a theme forum on its own. And I think in a nutshell, I'm going to pass it on to our panelists, if any of them would like to respond to your point or issue. Dave?
So for me, that relates to the risk, the future risk. And it was interesting that some of the landowners we engaged with saw the threats of this uncertainty around land, and were looking to potentially, as a benefit, to secure their areas as a protected area against the threat of what you've been talking about, and the loss of the land through these this upcoming policy. So, yeah, interestingly, some of them saw there as a potential benefit, but because it was quite uncertain, it wasn't a benefit they were too certain about. Yeah. But I think it relates to, even when areas are declared protected areas, you can still undeclare them. So there's always a risk. It's just it's an added level of protection that we give to land, but there is always a risk around that. But yeah, some of them saw that as a potential benefit.
Thanks, Dave. So I think it could work either way, in a nutshell. And because of the uncertainty at the moment, it's hard to really interrogate in full. Hugo, I think you had the next question. Or point.
Thank you. Hugo Rainey, Wildlife Conservation Society. I've noticed in your 2 slides you don't mention money. So given the long-term nature of this type of engagement and many mitigation projects, what guidance should lenders develop, and what sort of contractual conditions or how should they structure their finance so that you can have engagement and better mitigation and offsets in the long term?
Thanks very much, Hugo. We do have financing challenges somewhere in here, but it's probably on the slide above. But well noted. Thank you very much for that. There was a gentleman down the row from you with a hand raised. And there was somebody at the back, and then I'll come through to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Edgar Buhanga from Uganda Wildlife Authority. And my contribution to this is from experience that when we get EIAs for the residual impacts, the mitigation is biodiversity offset. And it stops there. Now the problem is, how do you implement that mitigation measure? And maybe what we need to capture here is to say that the EIA process should elaborate the offset mechanisms, that the offset is part and parcel of the EIA detail. 2, offset determination. I think, how do we determine the offset value? For me, if we could, if someone could help me and say this is the way we determine the offset value, that and probably that is part of the EIA process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those points. Panelists, would you like to comment on either the mitigation hierarchy or integration and the offset value? Andrew, are you going to come and contribute?
Yeah, no, I would agree with the EIA to incorporate the requirement for an offset. In experience with a lot of EIAs, we found that there's that uncertainty, that monitoring is often needed later to determine what is the scope when we can identify what the impact, when we can quantify exactly what that impact's going to be up in advance, then we can say exactly what the offset needs to be. But often we're guessing that impact. We need some kind of monitoring once it's implemented to actually quantify how big it's going to be. And when an offset can have some sort of flexibility in it, like our Ghana example, whereas Dave's example, where you've got a very defined boundary, you've got a very specific. So there's that challenge of that flexibility. Absolutely. Have I answered your full question? I'm not sure. Thanks.
I think just to quickly add, Pam, do you want to add something? Come, okay.
Thank you. Just to add on to what Andrew is saying, in terms of the mitigation hierarchy, I think the emphasis around whether the need to offset or not, it should be, you should go to the first step of the mitigation hierarchy. Are you able to avoid? If not, how are you going to minimize your risks? And you need to demonstrate through scientific assessments on how best you are able to mitigate those threats. Despite all those efforts, if there is still remaining impacts associated with that proposed project, then the need to rehabilitation comes into play, also through rigorous assessments upfront before the EIA process. So it's your pre-application phase, your screening phase. You need to make use of existing, in terms of South African context, our biodiversity planning tools available, your spatial planning tools to determine your level of risk. So if you have now factored into how you are going to rehabilitate. If there's still remaining impacts, obviously, then the need to offset will kick in. So that's it. I don't know. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but thank you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pam. There was a hand up right at the back. Can we go to... There was a hand right up. It is still there. Sorry, and I'll come to... I seem to have a blind spot on this side. My apologies. I'll come to you next, and I know there's a hand up there and a hand up here. Please try and keep it short because we are pressed for time.
Okay, now, thanks very much. My name is Puti Matlamela from Gauteng, Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Yeah, thanks to all the presenters. I think, Pamela, what you just said now is absolutely what we need to be, the approach that we need to be taking on biodiversity offset. We need to do everything at the beginning of the EIA process, because I was looking at the case study which was presented here with the EA of having two conditions in 2009. I'm looking at those two conditions, I'm asking myself, if a compliance monitoring guy is going on site, how is he going to make sure that those two conditions are implemented on site? There's no way that you can really enforce those. So hence it's important that at the beginning of the whole EIA process, we do your significant impact rating, you'll do your avoid, minimize and all that. If the residual impact still remains very high, then that's when you'll then take the route of the of the biodiversity offset. And there's instances whereby the biodiversity offset at all, you also have to say no, you can't even take that route. It's a no-go area, then we're not doing anything on that thing. So my other question was, I didn't really have a question on the offset because I've been involved with that. To the lady from Uganda, Justine, there's a slide, your number 2 slide that you showed there, whereby there's this road that is crossing through a protected area. Just for interest's sake, I'm interested to just know as to whether how much of that road, the length of that road, is within that protected area, and if there's any fatalities on the road, any studies done to check by your mammal scientists to check if whether there's any road killings on the road, how many are those, and maybe if you have a herpetofauna specialist who's doing avifauna to check, who's doing your reptiles, to check how many reptiles, amphibians that have been killed. Just the numbers to know the impact of that road within a protected area, if there's any killings on the road and all those things. It would be nice just to see the numbers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Justine, I don't know if there's time really to go into the detail, would you like to respond or? Okay, all right. Okay, Justine has offered to respond one-on-one after this session, which I think is probably the best strategy here. Let me go to this side of the room. Apologies for people who are missing on hands up, but yes.
Mine is an example. I'm from Uganda. With Frontier Energy, we are developing a couple of hydropower projects in the Mountain Elgon area. We have a project that is located inside the park, about 300 meters. That's where our intake is. And part of our plan was that because of the trees that we did cut for project development, we submitted a plan to the Uganda Wildlife Authority in regards to implementing a biodiversity offset. We went ahead and suggested about 35 hectares as our offset area. They suggested 70 hectares, but because there's no policy and the guidelines are really, they're non-existent really, we've done 70 hectares of restoration, and to date there's nothing to show for it. So it's a good thing that we are talking about how challenging it is to actually offset for a lot of developers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There was another question here, and then I'm going to jump back to the other side of the room. I know we are nearly finished, so I keep, again, a plea to keep it as short as possible.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much. Really interesting session. My name is Bruce Dunn from the Asian Development Bank based in Manila. 2 points that I wanted to raise in the context of a case study, which I'll just very briefly mention. First is in terms of the timing of setting financial commitments around offsets is absolutely critical. And then second is how you contextualize those commitments in the context of the existing constraints within the particular country that you're working in. The case that I'll just mention very briefly, we've been working in the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Southeast Asian country in the Mekong, for those that are familiar with that region, as a hydropower project. And what actually happened in this particular case is the private sector entity and the government entered into a concession agreement which set a requirement for a biodiversity offset at the very early stage before the EIA had really even kicked off. And so before we knew anything in terms of the biodiversity value and what really needed to be avoided in the application of the mitigation hierarchy, they'd already set $3.5 million for an offset. Now subsequently, many years down the track, we're now entering into a negotiation with the client around an offset program which is in excess of $25 million, which is capex that they've not set aside. So we're in a very difficult situation. And the reason why that has ended up being such a large commitment is essentially there are no conservation programs in Laos which are really working. So after a lot of anguish, everyone's pretty much kind of come to the conclusion that we really need to at least triple the amount of resources on the ground going to enforcement just to have a chance of getting to no net loss. So, you're really into an awkward situation, so timing is critical. Yeah, thanks.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for that. We are out of time, essentially. My apologies for those who still are waving hands in the air and hoping for a question. It's tragic that this session is so short. Dave, would you like to wrap up? And perhaps just if there's anything we want to add to our list and emphasize, and perhaps if we're going to give feedback to participants.
Okay. Thank you, Susie. Thanks to our team, and thanks to the inputs this morning. I think a lot of the issues and challenges we have up there, there weren't that many more, but I think the ones that were highlighted for me were around the financial issues. And when in the process you determine how much it's going to be and how much that is. And also going back to Andrew's case study where there's a level of uncertainty and there needs to be some kind of monitoring. Is how do you build that into the financing as well? So that's, what is the contingency around that? Tenure around the offset sites, I think, has also been highlighted as a major issue, which I think is also up there. And the other thing that kind of comes through for me is the importance of strong regulation around the mitigation hierarchy, ensuring that it's properly applied. And the case study that was just mentioned now is going to the offset before you've even done any investigation. It really requires strong regulation to ensure that the mitigation hierarchy is appropriately applied. So big issues around tenure and money and process, and ensuring that there's clarity both in the process and strong regulation around the information that is generated. So, we could go on all day, but there's a lot of other interesting things to go to. So thanks again very much to the panel. Thanks very much to you, and cheers to everyone who's watching on streaming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Please don't forget to do the session report online.
Okay. Do you have a deadline?
No, they didn't tell us, so I'm
Oh,
not sure.
okay. No, I'll do that.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for your help. Hi.
Very interesting presentation. I have a question.
Yes.
You said you had 15 kilometers.